Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
When he saw the crowds, Jesus went up the mountainside, and after he had sat down, his disciples came to him. He began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they who mourn, they will be comforted. Blessed the meek, for they shall inherit the land. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, because they will have mercy shown them. Blessed are the clean of heart, they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, they shall be called children of God. Blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." A gospel inspired by God. I have a friend who's a teacher in Palo Alto High School, and he teaches history there. And especially he loves AP history, where really gifted kids who are really interested in history, like to congregate. And he was telling me a few years ago, he had a class just of 5 kids who were really interested in history. And at one stage, he set them to write an essay on the American Revolution. And there were 5 kids in the class. One of the kids was called John, the other kid was called Q, one of the kids was called Luke, another kid was called Matt, another kid was called Mark. So he set them this essay, and they go off to do their home exercises, and he says, the interesting characters, kind of OCD types, because Q always liked to have his home exercise done by 6 p.m. Mark liked to have his done by 7 p.m. Matthew liked to have his done by 8 p.m. Luke liked to do his by 9 p.m. and then John was always the last. John always did his stuff around 10 p.m. at night. And so at 6 p.m., Q starts working on his essay. And he does his research and he writes this great paper on the American Revolution, and he finishes up. And about an hour later, Mark starts writing his. And Mark is going great guns, and he does his own essay, very, very happy with it, and he finishes it fairly shortly. Then about 8 o'clock, Matt starts his essay. And he starts writing his own stuff, and he's doing great goshka, doing great work. And then he remembers his friend Q and Mark, that they're early birds, so he hacks into their computer. And he borrows a whole bunch of stuff from Q, and he borrows a whole bunch of stuff from Mark, and he incorporates it into his own essay. And then an hour later, Luke is doing his stuff. It's now 9 o'clock at night, and Luke is starting to do his essay. So he starts writing his stuff, and he does his research, and he writes his essay. And then he remembers as well, Q and Mark like to finish their essays early, so he hacks into their computers, and he borrows a whole bunch of stuff from Q and from Mark, and he incorporates it into his essay. And then at 10 o'clock, John is doing his. And John is a kid with real integrity. He would never copy from anybody. So John did his own essay. He didn't copy, he didn't hack into anybody, and he did his own essay. And then about 11 o'clock at night, all of a sudden, Mark says, "Gee, I think I left something out of my essay." And he can't remember what it is. So he hacks into Luke, and he hacks into John, and he borrows a whole bunch of stuff from Luke and John, and he adds it onto his essay. So next day they come to school, and they're now handing up hard copy of their essays. But Q is sick. He can't make it. He's at home with the flu. So he doesn't hand up his essay at all. So only the other 4 guys hand up their essays. And so the teacher goes out at recess, and he's going to correct the essays. And he's still looking at the essays, and all of a sudden he says, there's something really fishy about this. Because he knew these kids really well. And he knew, for instance, that Q always writes his essays in 12-point times. And he knows that Mark always does his essays in 14-point times. And he knows that Matthew always does his essays in 12-point Helvetica. And he knows that Luke always does his essays in 14-point Helvetica. And John always does his stuff in 12-point Geneva. But all of a sudden, as he's looking at these texts, there's a whole bunch of stuff in different font sizes and different kinds of fonts. Because as the guys borrowed stuff, they just cut it and copied it and pasted it into their own essays and never revised the script, the font, or the font size. So it's immediately obvious. So he calls these guys in And he can immediately deduce. He can see very, very obviously that John did his own essay and he didn't copy from anybody, so John is in the clear. And Q isn't there, but he sees they've copied from Q. Because Q, as I said, always used 12-point times. And there's a whole bunch of stuff in Mark's Gospel and in Mark and in Luke that's borrowed from this font size. So he knows now immediately that Matt has copied from Mark and he's copied from Q. And he can see that Luke has copied from Mark and he's copied from Q. And you can see also somehow that Mark managed to copy from Luke and from John. So he reads them the riot act. True story. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to make 4 main points today. I'm going to talk about biblical hacking, and then I'm going to talk about editing the Bible, and then thirdly I'll talk about imitation is the highest form of flattery, and then finally I'm going to talk about the Beatitudes, which was the gospel reading for today. So Bible hacking. For the longest period of time, up to about the 1850s, people believed that each of the Gospels was written, one was written by Matthew, one was written by Mark, one by Luke, one by John, and they were independent entities who just did their own stuff, totally inspired by God. And then in the 1850s, a group of great German scholars began to be able to differentiate among writing styles. They could tell very, very easily, what writing style each of these Gospel writers had. And they understood, for instance, that Mark was a soldier. Although they're all writing in Greek, Mark's Greek was very, very crude and very poor. John was a fisherman. His Greek was a little bit better than Mark's, but not great. Luke, on the other hand, was a physician. Luke wrote very beautiful Greek, and Paul wrote the best Greek of all. And Matthew, who was a tax collector, was in some place between. So they could immediately see the styles of each of these 4 players. And they began to realize they were borrowing from each other. They began to realize that the order of the Gospels wasn't Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. That Mark had been written about 70 AD, that Matthew was written about 80 AD, that Luke was written about 90 AD, and John was written about 100 AD. And they could see from the styles, from the script style and from the material in it and the style of the writing itself, they could see that Matthew and Luke borrowed a whole bunch of stuff from Mark. And they just cut and pasted it. It looked totally out of place. The way it was situated in their gospel, it just jarred, it stuck out immediately. And they also noticed something really interesting, that there was a whole bunch of stuff they found in Matthew and they found in Luke. It wasn't their style, but it wasn't Mark's style either. So they inferred there must have been some other source that they both borrowed from, but that source has never been found. And because they're German scholars, they call it Q for Quelle, which means the source. And so they borrowed from this document. It's never been found, but they borrowed from, and you can infer it very, very easily, because the style is very, very different from Matthew's style and from Luke's style, but it's not Mark's. They didn't borrow it from Mark, so they borrowed it from elsewhere. And it was obvious to them that John didn't borrow from anybody. And so they could reconstruct this entire thing. They could give a timeline and find out what the influences were. And so there was Bible hacking going on way back at that time. They were borrowing left, right, and center from each other. That's my first point. Second point is biblical editing. After these books had been written, then subsequently other editors went in and they began to revise them. So for instance, it's interesting that although Mark is the first of the canonical Gospels written, Mark's Gospel ends in chapter 16, verse 9, with the women going to the tomb and finding the tomb empty after Jesus had been buried. But there's no account whatsoever of a resurrection appearance of Jesus. In Mark's Gospel, there's no account that Jesus rose from the dead. There's just an empty tomb. And the women run away and they tell nobody. That's the end of Mark's Gospel, chapter 16, verse 9. So that didn't satisfy the editors. So the editors of Mark's Gospel, they pulled stories from John's Gospel and they pulled stories from Luke's Gospel and they added them on to the end of Mark's Gospel. So Mark's Gospel has 3 totally different endings. There's the normal ending, and then there's a second ending where they took a bunch of stories, the editors, from John's account of the resurrection of Jesus, and they added those onto Mark's Gospel. And then they took a bunch of stories from Luke's Gospel, and they added them on to the end of Mark's Gospel. So Mark's Gospel has 3 totally different endings. So that's the first thing that they realized. The second thing they realized is there was a reason why they shifted the order. when, I'm sure if you were like me, when you learned the 4 Gospels, the order was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There was even a rhyme about it, blessed the bed that I lie on. We used to say that as a prayer. But they found out that that was not the order. The order was Mark first, then Matthew, then Luke and John. So why did they invert the order? Why did they shift the order of Matthew and Mark? For a very interesting reason. Matthew's Gospel was written for a Jewish Christian audience living in Rome. And that's where Peter exercised his ministry, and that's where Peter died. Peter was crucified in the year 65 AD. He died in Rome. He was the leader of the Rome church. He was not the leader of the Jerusalem church. That was James, the brother of Jesus. And so Matthew's Gospel is written for a Jewish audience, Jewish Christians living in Rome under the leadership of Peter. So they're going to try to emphasize Peter as primacy. So they insert a story right into the middle of chapter 16 of Matthew's Gospel. Matthew has 28 chapters. They insert a story right in the middle, a story that you don't find in any of the other Gospels. And it's the story that says, Tu es Petrus et super hanc Petram edificare ecclesiam meam. You are Peter, and upon this church, upon this rock, I will build my church. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom. And whatever you declare bound on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you declare null on earth will be null in heaven. You don't find that anywhere except in Matthew's Gospel. So in fact, when you look at the other synoptic Gospels, Mark has the story that goes up to it, to that incident, and the story that comes after it, but that piece is missing. Luke has the story that goes up to it, but that piece is missing. And the story that goes up to it is this. Christ is walking along the road, and he stops all of a sudden, and he says to his disciples, who do people think that I am? And they say, well, some people think you're John the Baptist come back to life. Some people think you're Elijah. Some people think you're one of the Old Testament prophets. And Christ says, okay, you guys have been with me now for 3 years. Who do you think that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus says to him, blessed are you, Simon, son of John, because flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And that's the end of the story in Mark's Gospel, and that's the end of the story in Luke's Gospel. Only Matthew adds the piece, and therefore you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. So that was inserted much, much later in order to show the primacy of Peter and the primacy of the Roman church. So they inverted the order of the Gospels in order to reflect that. So that's something we don't realize. We think that this is the order in which they were written. The second thing you begin to see when you look at the editing of the Gospels, and indeed of the whole Bible, is that there was lots of disputes going on in the early Christian churches. It was not a uniform, dogmatically decreed system of beliefs. Different communities had totally different scriptures and totally different belief systems, and there was quite a lot of animosity between them. Even in the canonical scriptures, you get a great controversy going on, particularly in Paul's letter to the Galatians and in the Acts of the Apostles, between Peter and James on the one hand, who are very, very staunch Orthodox Jews, even though they're now followers of Jesus, on one hand, and on the other hand, Paul, who's working with the Gentile audience, around the issue of whether or not Gentiles who want to become Christians first need to become Jews, and if they're males, get circumcised and keep all the kosher laws and all 613 precepts of Torah, or whether they can just go from being Gentiles to being Christians without having to become Jews in the process. And there's this huge controversy that goes on between Paul on the one side and Peter and James on the other side. And you find it reflected in the canonical scriptures, particularly in the Acts of the Apostles, and especially in Paul's letter to the Galatians. So there's this animosity going on even within the context of the canonical scriptures. But particularly you see it between the canonical scriptures and the Gnostic scriptures. So initially there's lots and lots of material, lots of writings from many, many traditions. But the big difference between the Gnostic material and the stuff that finally gets agreed upon as being canonically part of Scripture is that the Gnostics had very many women leaders. Mary of Magdala was the leader of a very vibrant Christian community and the author of a gospel. So in the Gnostic scriptures, women were accorded equal valence with men as leaders of communities and as writers of Scripture. This, however, was not acceptable in the patriarchal system, when finally the church was being persecuted, and in order to survive, it figured out we need to sacrifice this. We need to sacrifice the women because we won't get credibility or respectability as long as there are women leaders. So we have to go back to this patriarchal, hierarchical system. So there's this huge controversy that goes on between the Gnostic scriptures, where women have equal power and authority with the men, and where the emphasis is on personal experiences of the numinous, personal mystical experiences rather than belief in a set of dogmas. And so there'll be this huge divide in the Gnostic scriptures and the canonical scriptures between empowering women and relying on personal experiences, the divine mystical experiences in the Gnostic communities, and on the other side of it, relying on dogmatic decrees from male leadership. And when finally in the year 312 AD, Constantine made Christianity an official religion of the Roman Empire, Christianity sold its soul in a Faustian bargain. It took on the status quo and the credibility of hierarchy and patriarchy, and it sacrificed women and it sacrificed mysticism. So you see this controversy raging right throughout the scriptures themselves. Which brings me to my third point. I call it imitation is the highest form of flattery. You see imitation all the ways through in human history and in human religion. So for instance, the Hebrew scriptures, particularly the book of Genesis, is just totally plagiarized from the Sumerian writings. The Hebrew scriptures began to be written down about the year 950 BC. The last books are written about 200 BC. So for about a period of 700 years, they're being written. The Sumerian scriptures go way, way, way back before that, 2,000 years before that. So many of the great stories that we learned in the book of Genesis particularly are straight out of the Sumerian scriptures. Like the creation story, that creation happened in 6 days and God rested on the Sabbath. This comes from the fact that there were 7 great tablets of the creation mythology of the Sumerians. And so the Hebrews borrowed that completely from the Sumerians. The story of the creation of Adam is taken totally from the Sumerian scriptures. The story of the flood. The names are different, obviously. In the Bible story, the guy is called Noah, and Noah escapes with his 3 sons, their wives, 8 people. In the Sumerian scriptures, the guy is called Utnapishtim. And he escapes from the flood. He doesn't take animals aboard the ark, as happens in the Bible story. Rather, an angel extracts the essence of all the life forms, the DNA of all the life forms on the planet, and they hold it in a submersible. It's not an ark that floats on the water. It's a submersible that goes underwater and is guided by an angel pilot. So they borrowed this and they changed the story slightly. The story of Babel is straight out of the Sumerian scriptures as well. So you can see that the Hebrew scriptures are an imitation of much, much earlier ones. The story of Moses is totally borrowed also from the Sumerians, from Akkadia, in fact. The story that Moses was a little baby whom the Pharaoh was trying to kill, and his mother put him in a little basket, covered it with pitch, and floated down the Nile in the year about 1250 BC, is totally plagiarized. It's the story of Sargon I, who was the king of Mesopotamia around the year 2300 BC. So this is 1100 years before the Moses story. And the story of this was that there was this priestess in the temple in Akkadia, which was a part of Mesopotamia, and she gave birth to a child. And she was embarrassed about this, and she put the child in a little basket, covered with a pitch, and floated down the Euphrates, not the Nile, the Euphrates. And it was discovered by a gardener, a guy called Akkad. And Akkad took it home, and he adopted this child and made the child his own. And the child grew up, and because he was really, really bright, he finally worked his way up to being the cup holder for the king of Akkadia. And finally, he supplanted this guy and became the king himself. And he ruled over Akkadia and united all of Mesopotamia over a period of several decades. So this is taken totally out of Sargon I. In fact, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Moses ever existed. The Egyptians were extraordinarily fastidious record keepers. There is no record that 1.3 million slaves escaped out of Egypt around the year 1250 BC. There's no record whatsoever of it. So Moses, in fact, in some senses is a Genesis myth, a myth to make up to understand the origins of a particular ethnic group of people. So he probably never existed. Now, so Moses, who never existed, is the copying or plagiarizing Sargon I, who did exist, and then Jesus is an imitation of who Moses is. So when you look at, for instance, the 4 Gospels, each of the Gospels has a very, very different agenda because it's written to a very different audience. Matthew's Gospel is written for a Jewish audience living in Rome. And so it's very, very much trying to prove that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures. Luke's Gospel, on the other hand, Luke is the only biblical writings done by a non-Jewish author, the only Gentile to write any part of Scripture. And Luke is responsible for the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. And Luke has a very, very different agenda from Matthew. Luke is writing for a Gentile audience, and he's showing Christ not as the fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures, but as a cosmic entity. And so in Luke's Gospel, the writings of Luke are divided into 2 parts. One is called the Gospel, one is the Acts of the Apostles. But they're actually 2 parts of the same work, both dedicated to the same man, a guy called Theophilus. And the first part of the work is a single journey that Jesus makes from Nazareth, where he grew up, to Jerusalem, where he died. If you read Luke's Gospel, you'll be forgiven for thinking that the entire life of Jesus, his entire public ministry, consisted of a single safari that started in Nazareth and ended in Jerusalem with his death. So the first part of his work shows Jesus being born in Nazareth and dying in Jerusalem. The second part of Luke's work starts in Jerusalem, the Acts of the Apostles, and ends up in Rome. So now it's becoming, true for the entire empire. It's not just a Jewish phenomenon, and it's not even just an empirical phenomenon for the entire empire. When Jesus is born in Luke's Gospel, the angels attend his birth. In Matthew's Gospel, it's wise men come from the east to acknowledge the supremacy of the Hebrew people. In Luke's Gospel, it's very different. It's angels that come, showing that this is a cosmic event. This is not just a national event. This is a cosmic event. So Luke has a very, very different agenda from Matthew. But Matthew is intent on proving to a Jewish audience that Jesus is indeed the fulfillment of all of the prophecies of the Hebrew Scriptures. And so Jesus is shown in Matthew's Gospel as a second Moses. So just like Moses, somehow Matthew has to get Jesus down into Egypt so that he can escape from Egypt, like Moses brought the people out. So he invents this story that Herod tried to kill all the children of 2 years and under, and therefore Jesus, whose daddy was warned in a dream, had to fly down to Egypt so that he can come back out of Egypt. So he had to force him down there in order to fulfill the scripture, I will call my son out of Egypt. So he invents this entire story. There is no record of Herod ever killing the babies aged 2 and under in the land of Israel. So now he becomes a second Moses. And in this process, Moses is responsible for allegedly the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The belief system was that Moses wrote all of these books. Now, he didn't exist for one thing, probably, and even if he did, he didn't write these books, because the books themselves, the book of Exodus ends with an account of Moses' death. So how could Moses write an account of his own death? And then also in the book of Exodus, we're told that Moses was the meekest man who ever walked planet Earth. What kind of a humble guy claims to be the humblest guy on the earth? So Moses didn't write any of these, and again, the great German scholars show that it wasn't written by an individual. It was written by 4 totally different schools of people over the course of 400 or 500 years. And so, but since it was believed that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Matthew will divide his gospel into 5 significant sections. So he's indicating that the teaching of Jesus recapitulates the first 5 books written by Moses. And just as Moses led the people into the promised land, Jesus will lead the new people into a new promised land. But it won't be a physical location, it will be the kingdom of heaven. And just like Moses fed the Israelites in the desert with sacred bread from heaven, Jesus will feed the 5,000 in the desert with sacred bread that he's manufactured himself. So Matthew is at pains to show that Jesus is the new Moses. And so you see this imitation constantly. So the Hebrew scriptures are imitating the Sumerian scriptures. Moses is an imitation of Sargon, and Jesus is an imitation of Moses. And you get this right throughout Christian history again. The same notion that we're trying to invent Jesus in our own image. And Christianity has done an extraordinary job at this. Different stages of Christian development have given us totally different portraits of who Jesus was. So in some instances, Jesus is seen as a real law-abiding Jew. In other situations, Jesus is an anti-Semite who invades mightily against his own people. In some instances, Jesus is merely a liberal social reformer. This is the Jesus that the Democrats love. In other situations, Jesus is the real staunch ally of the status quo. And this is the Jesus that the Republicans love. In other places, Jesus is a liberation theologian. In some places, Jesus is the only Son of God. In other places, unless you believe in Jesus, you can't go to heaven. In other places, Jesus is a judge who leads the crusades and slaughters the Jews and the Muslims and the Orthodox Christians. And Jesus is the judge then who initiates an inquisition against non-believers within his own tribe. So you get all these totally different pictures of Jesus. Now, will the real Jesus please stand up? The real Jesus we find in the Beatitudes. And it's interesting, you've got two versions of the Beatitudes as well. You've got Matthew's version of the Beatitudes, which is what I read today, and you get Luke's version of the Beatitudes. Very probably, they took them from Q. They hacked into Q, and they got a version of the Beatitudes, and then they altered them to suit their own agenda and their own audiences. But so I want to just end by saying a few words about what the Beatitudes mean to me. So for me, the Beatitudes are, firstly, they're a love poem. And they're done in a Hebrew style of poetry. There's a great style of Hebrew poetry which is called Semitic parallelism. And Semitic parallelism is where you take an idea and using different metaphors, you treat of the same idea at different levels. It's like a fractalization of a poem. It's like viewing a poem in at different scales. And so you get the very same idea, blessed, 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 and it's repeated for slightly different portraits. So you get this beautiful love poem, which is what it essentially is. But then there's these two versions in it. And in Matthew's Gospel, which I read, Christ will say, blessed are X, blessed are Y, blessed are Z. In Luke's account, every single one is blessed are X, damned are Y. And so for every blessed, he shows the other side. Now, what does this mean? Is Luke saying that there are good groups and bad groups, and so the good groups are blessed and the bad groups are damned? Or is he saying there are good individuals and there are bad individuals, and the good individuals are blessed and the bad aren't? Rather, it seems to me he's showing that this divide is not a divide between communities, between the saved and the unwashed masses, or it's not between individual good guys and individual bad guys. It's a line that runs through every single one of us. It is the line between the narcissistic ego and the selfless soul, which is part of each one of us. And so part of us, every single one of us, is blessed because we're aligned, and part of us is not blessed because we're misaligned. So it's something that runs through the individual psyche. It doesn't separate us, A from B, or group from group, or religion from religion, or ethnic group from ethnic group. It is not about that. In fact, if it is anything, it is a love song that creates a morphogenetic field. A morphogenetic field was a concept invented by an English biologist called Rupert Sheldrake. And he believed that before nature throws up any new life form, it first creates a template. And then it uses this template to manifest and to articulate into physicality. In much the same way if you want to build a house, the first thing you have to do is you've got to draw a plan. And the second thing you do is you gather materials. And the third thing you do is you employ a workforce. And you bring a plan, materials, and a workforce together, and then you get a real house, a real three-dimensional, live-inable house. The same thing is true with whether it's cabbage that comes on the planet or giraffes that come on the planet. There's a template set up first. And through this template, the love of God flows, and it gathers up carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen from the world as it already is, and it fashions a whole new life form. For me, the Beatitudes are a morphogenetic field in which the avatars sang a song. They sang a love song into the cacophony of tribal violence and sectarian division. And they've been singing this love song in various versions for the last 2,500 years. And Jesus gave perhaps the most beautiful articulation of all. And this really is what the Beatitudes are about. The Beatitudes are a love song creating a morphogenetic field to introduce symphony and harmony into the existing cacophony of tribal and sectarian division. The Beatitudes are they're a lullaby which a mother is singing over a child with a fever. And like any mother, she will keep singing the same lullaby until the fever diminishes and the child gets well.